The Second Crusade has failed, but its end will open the door to the Plantagenets, that brilliant, avaricious, rebellious, murderous family that will dominate the history of Western Europe for a century to come. Here's their story, so riveting that we still are fascinated by it 900 years later.
Welcome back to Lion's Forge. My name is Becket, and I want to tell you a story. An epic, true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 2, Episode 14. The cubs will awaken and roar aloud. While Henry would swear for the rest of his life that he had never ordered Becket's death, there were widely circulated reports that Henry's court that Christmas season of love and peace was marked by Plantagenet tantrums over the disrespect visited upon his august person by the commoner Henry had transformed into a prince. An eyewitness to the murder, a monk named Edward Grimm, claimed that Henry had furiously shouted about feeding courtly layabouts, while His Majesty was being treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk. Henry Plantagenet was certainly well aware that a king's retainers, anxious for royal favor, can take even a drunken royal rant as a signal. King and Archbishop had been publicly at war with each other for the better part of a decade by now. Whatever Henry said about Becket during alcohol-fueled Christmas feasting, and it's probably not true that he said, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" wording that didn't appear until some 650 years later. Henry had to know that someone might decide to make his unhappy monarch happy. And we have clues that Henry did know it, since there is some evidence that he made a belated effort to have the knights stopped after they left his gates. If he did, the effort failed. He himself actually learned the macabre news of Thomas's death several days later. There are some stories that the king was speechless with horror, so sickened by his old friend's terrible end that he shut himself away for days, refusing food, refusing comfort, throwing penitential ashes on himself. Long after it was over, he would tell people with evident emotion that the deaths of his own parents hadn't been as devastating. On the other hand, some cooler analysts of our day note that the king did nothing to have the killers captured and punished. There's also a letter Henry quickly wrote to the Pope, essentially blaming everything on Thomas. As Becket's biographer Anne Duggan notes, Henry didn't sound surprised at what had happened, much less remorseful. His only comment was the rather offhand remark that some of the men Becket had excommunicated on Christmas Day fell upon him and killed him. Hardly a sorrow-filled mea culpa, especially as none of the murderers were targets of Becket's Christmas Day excommunications. No one dared openly accuse Henry, but rustlings and whispers of his involvement swirled throughout England and across Europe. There was a rumor, startlingly believable, that an English nobleman had begged the prayers of monks late in 1170 because a terrible thing was about to happen. Others claimed to have seen the secret royal document ordering Becket's death. Nor did the murmured accusations quickly die down. Instead, they became increasingly focused and specific. One anonymous piece, written several years later, said, "We would be inclined to excuse the king for this crime if he had not received the murderers in his kingdom, if he had not allowed them to pass through his town and castles, if he had not allowed them to hunt in his woods, and if he had not defended them, because he knew that they had done it for love of him." The Pope ultimately excommunicated everyone involved in any way in Becket's death, saving the king, who swore that he had neither ordered nor desired Becket's death, but who still promised to do penance, some say pledging to go on crusade. Henry himself escaped the gory disaster, sailing across the gray-green ruffled surface of the Irish Sea into the wilds of that country for the better part of the next year. Enforcement of the viciously fought constitutions of Clarendon died on the vine. Young Henry had to be recrowned. The king then turned on the assassins, no matter that his own scorching temper had undoubtedly been the force behind their crime. He disinherited all of their heirs. All 4 men at the scene of Becket's death would come to die in the Holy Land, exile imposed by the Church as penance for their awful sin. Their names have been preserved through the centuries: Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, Reginald Fitzurse, and Richard Le Bret. Like Henry himself, their fame today rests on their evil 800 years ago. Thousands of mourners hastened to Becket's grave at Canterbury to pay their respects. But Henry's first visit to Thomas's tomb only came at long last in 1174, in the midst of an ugly war that was not going his way. He swore again, this time publicly, that even in his anger he had never sought Becket's death. But it is true that after that date, for the rest of his life, whenever he returned to England from a trip abroad, he would first stop to pray at England's foremost shrine. He would live for the better part of another 20 years, never entirely escaping his reputation as that most infamous man, not so much king of the English as enemy of the angels. Everywhere Henry went, he would see people carrying little metal boxes depicting the murder scene, mass-produced in Limoges, or bottles of Canterbury water, a rather ghoulish knockoff of the blood that had been threaded across the cathedral floor. For that matter, some of Becket's actual blood was said to have been mopped up and then enterprisingly mixed with water and sold as a kind of patent medicine. Draped in the moral shroud of the murder, Henry could only watch as his greatest friend and greatest enemy swiftly became a worshipped saint. Dozens of miracles were attributed to the Archbishop's heavenly intercession, including 2 widely celebrated cases of castrated men regaining their virility. The saint even displayed sufficient goodwill to raise one of the king's favorite hawks from the dead. Thomas's image soon appeared in stained glass, statues, paintings, calendars, and books, and not just in England. If Henry had been inclined to travel, he could have found Thomas in France, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Iceland, Portugal, and Sicily. The King of France, with any number of pilgrimage sites to choose from, would one day come to Canterbury to beg Thomas to save the life of his only son. Henry's own daughter Matilda commissioned a picture for her Bible showing her family under Becket's protection. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, that hymn to medieval life, still testified to the immense popularity of Becket's shrine 200 years after Becket's death. Despite some squabbling that broke out almost as soon as Thomas was buried over whether he was truly a martyr for the faith or just the victim of his own pig-headed stubbornness, the Church canonized him with considerable speed. While achieving the status of a saint usually takes decades, Becket became St. Thomas in just 3 years. Henry had not killed a man. Henry had killed a saint. Indeed, the act of killing had created the saint, who now would ride Henry's shoulder until he died. What happened to Henry's family in the years after Becket's death was, in many people's minds, nothing but fair retribution for Henry's crime. One wonders if the Plantagenets, with their soured marriages and ferocious internecine wars, were ever happy for more than a season or two. Henry's parents had loathed each other. He had fought his own brother at sword point. Now his wife and sons were going down the same tortured road. By the time Becket died, the boys were no longer children. Young Henry was 15 the year of the murder, an adult in medieval eyes, recently consecrated king-in-waiting. He acted the part. According to chroniclers, he was already considered a notable knight, tall, muscular, and extremely handsome, witty and courteous, the image of his grandfather, Geoffrey le Bel. Many a young lady had to be desolate that as a mere child he had been married to Princess Marguerite of France. His father adored him, and he wasn't alone. Young Henry's combination of good looks, money, and royal heir apparent status gave him the affable charm that flows naturally from an enviable life. He was hospitable, extroverted, generous to a fault, fonder of his mother's refinements than his father's rough-hewn style. There are stories of his sharing his flask of wine on a hunt by pouring it out to flavor a spring, or of inviting every knight in Normandy named William to join him for Christmas dinner one year. He was also, as might be expected, absolutely full of himself. There's an old story that after his coronation at the age of 15, his father hosted a splendid banquet, stepping in to serve the main course to the new monarch himself. Henry made some humorous comment that it was certainly unusual to see a king waiting tables, to which young Henry drawled in response, "But it's not unusual to see the son of a count waiting upon the son of a king." His younger brother Richard, 13 that year, was Eleanor's instinctive favorite, just as young Henry was his father's. Eleanor's unabashed favor toward Richard throughout their lives reminded everyone of an old prophecy, that the eagle shall rejoice in her third nestling, an assessment which obviously ignored her daughters. Like his brother, Richard gave every promise of becoming a remarkable man. Tall, he seems to have been well over 6 feet when mature. Strong, handsome, athletic, and absolutely fearless. He had inherited much from each parent, this one, combining their mutual intelligence, energy, and daring. Spending most of his childhood in his mother's care, she would always call him Carissmum, my dearest, a term she never applied to any of her other offspring. Like her, he adored the half-wild Aquitaine, his promised inheritance, and was unruffled that his brother would be King of England. Richard didn't care, rarely even visiting that country. Looking back on it, Richard and his older brother probably should have traded their inheritances, creating a far better fit between individual temperament and dynastic success. The Aquitaine, like young Henry, was proud, lavish, in love with excitement, bored by obligation, hospitable, lazy, and intolerant of any reign. Its Lord Richard, regrettably for both sides, was quickly becoming a man who demanded obedience, was bored by ceremony, and seemed poised to become quite the tyrant, undiplomatic, incapable of compromise, and determined to be master. Gerald of Wales, never a fan of the Plantagenets, was of the opinion that Richard cared only for success reached by his own sword and stained with his opponent's blood. There's a story from his crusade, the Third, that he got into it with a French knight named William de Bars during an impromptu jousting match, which quickly turned from a casual sporting contest into a belligerent, knock-down, drag-out fight that Richard wasn't winning. He yelled at anyone who tried to calm things down and bellowed a curse at Bars, I will be an enemy to thee and thine forever." Rather like his hot-headed father, the man held grudges that he simply wasn't about to let go. He was, in short, exactly the kind of ruler most likely to provoke rebellion from Aquitanian lords, as delighted to strap on swords and call in their archers as he was. For the better part of his life as a Plantagenet prince, Richard fought battle after battle across this jewel of the family empire, sometimes supported by his older brother, sometimes by his father, sometimes by no one at all. The chaos, the heart-pounding excitement, the live-or-die luck that ruled every battlefield was what he most wanted from life. It didn't seem to matter to him whether he earned men's esteem and loyalty. He was perfectly happy forcing them to fear him. Just a year younger than Richard, Geoffrey had the misfortune of being the classic middle child, crammed into the center of that brawling, squalling crowd of Plantagenet kiddies, neither prized oldest nor lovable new baby. Even his name seemed a hand-me-down, considering that he had an illegitimate half-brother with the very same name, who was raised in the same household. Geoffrey had the family's physical presence, intelligence, energy, and stamina, but he lived in the shade cast by the bigger boys. His inheritance, Brittany, was a restless, lawless sideshow among the more lavish Plantagenet holdings. Apparently, life in Brittany was not something people aspired to. Centuries later, a critic of the French government of the day feared that if he were too outspoken, he'd be sent to rot in the depths of Brittany. One wonders what would have become of a Geoffrey given more favorable ground, but he didn't get it. What he got was a lifelong rivalry with his more valued older brothers, and an apparent lifelong fascination with intrigue, stealth, insinuation, the secret pilfering of things that belonged to others. He demonstrated no love for either parent, or, for that matter, for mankind in general, growing instead into a sour, clever prince who seemed happiest masterminding plots or looting churches. There were 4 more Plantagenets nesting in that crowded family tree. Matilda, the eldest daughter, age 14, had been married for 2 years by now to Henry the Lion of Saxony. They had not yet had a child. The little girls, Eleanor and Joan, were 8 and 5. Baby John was barely 3. All of these later offspring were of little consequence compared to young Henry and Richard. Nothing but girls and an apparently unnecessary baby boy. By 1170, this family was about to fracture under its many pressures, beginning with those which harried their personal lives like perpetual thunderstorms. The father had a murderous temper, an outsized ego, was careless about where he slept, and was rarely home. The status of the oldest sons had been dramatically upgraded, with consequences yet to play out. There was the perpetual strain of war with rebellious vassals, who considered themselves bullied into armed rebellion as Henry swept more and more control into his own hands. Looming over all was the Becket disaster. Nor does it take much imagination to parse out what had to be Eleanor's irritated boredom with an official life that by now contained little more of interest than it had with Louis Capet. Days back in the Aquitaine might be entirely delightful, but she had once been Henry's imperial regent, as well as his desired bedmate. Now, in her mid-40s, she was a married queen who lived her life without her husband. His infatuated liaison with Rosamund Clifford, public knowledge, even among the least well-informed. At Eleanor's age, Henry's mother Matilda had already been widowed twice, and long finished with child-rearing. She had seen fit to retire to her lands and do good works. Henry may have prayed that his estranged wife would take the same modest path, but Eleanor was still married to a living king, still a queen and a duchess, mother of a newly made young king, mother of princes. This woman was not about to leave her world. Yet Henry had stupidly turned from her, preferring women half her age with a fraction of her intelligence, energy, and ability. Aside from Christmas and Easter courts, she rarely saw her husband from the time John was born. Eleanor and Henry were undoubtedly two of the most famous people of the day, except for the Pope, Thomas Becket, and maybe the King of France. It would be hard to say who might be their equals. Sensational notoriety breeds curiosity, and curiosity searches out ways to satisfy itself. The Plantagenets were popularly thought recognizable in several contemporary books, particularly those by Gerald of Monmouth. Despite sophisticates mocking that Gerald's writings were so filled with bald-faced lies that devils couldn't wait to read them, his retellings of old Arthur legends were eagerly snapped up by readers of the day. Monmouth had a true hit with his supposed discovery of the prophecies of an Arthurian wizard named Merlin. Merlin's predictions were generally pretty dismal forecasts of famine, war, and pestilence, when they weren't just mystical-sounding gobbledygook, such as, "The hedgehog will hide its apples inside Winchester." Still, some bits and pieces could be considered remarkably telling. People thought they could see the Plantagenets when they came across lines like, "Two kings will fight each other for the sake of a lioness. The eagle will exult in her third nestling," or "The cubs will awaken and roar aloud." The cubs were indeed beginning to awaken, particularly the oldest, young Henry. Now in his late teens, not far off the age his father had been when he took possession of his entire empire, young Henry had been duly crowned and anointed a king. What he didn't have was a kingdom. Richard, and even Geoffrey, had some actual administrative responsibilities in their inherited domains, but young Henry was kept in a condition little better than prolonged adolescence by his doting but domineering father. Even though the son was now a crowned king, and long married to boot, his father appointed the senior members of his household and doled out an allowance inadequate to such a prince, an allowance which evaporated as soon as it arrived. Yet Henry was not unaware of the need to train his heir. Excellent tutors, including Thomas Becket back in the day, and William Marshall, the greatest knight of his generation, had charge of the young man, teaching him the ways of royalty along with the machinery of government. Unfortunately, the machinery of government is not particularly compelling when you have no real control over any part of it. The handsome, charming young king-in-waiting quickly grew bored with his lessons, directing his energies not toward scholarship, warfare, or piety, but instead toward becoming one of the top players in the newly fashionable pastime of tournaments, the rage among underemployed male aristocrats of the day. Tournaments were on the cusp of the intriguing, alluring, exciting forbidden. Even Henry, who certainly wasn't loath to wade into a fight, refused to permit tournaments in England. They were also outlawed in Louis Capet's Ile-de-France, but were allowed in the Aquitaine, Normandy, and Flanders. Opposition came from the church, which viewed them as occasions of sin, and from royal displeasure at the general wreckage they left behind, not to mention the risk of injury to fighting men who might be needed for more serious matters elsewhere. But they were immensely popular, and, with little else to do, young Henry traveled incessantly from one to the next, his celebrity bringing out the crowds, his deep, if indebted pockets funding his own stable of knights. Watching him play at mock war, observers of an older generation might recall that when his father was his age, the elder Henry had already tried to invade England. Of course, the elder Henry had also had Geoffrey le Bel for a parent, a man who gave Normandy up to his son when that son was only 16. Henry Plantagenet evidently had no intention of imitating his father. Barely middle-aged himself, he was in no hurry to step even slightly aside. He knew he had to oversee an organized succession among his heirs, especially his oldest son, to ward off the wreckage of his empire. He would have to do it, but not too soon. Just not too soon. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Becket Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle Knabb. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again June 10th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.